Hello everyone, and welcome to Same Old News, with your host, Josh. Episode 4. The Right Wing and its Mouthpieces. Hello everyone, and welcome to Same Old News, the show that dissects the news past and present and tries to make some links between them. Well, I was not expecting what happened in the news last week in British politics. If you don't know what it is I'm referring to, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called a general election much earlier than pretty much all political commentators were predicting. So I need to set up my proxy vote again, as I wasn't expecting to need it for more than the local elections last month, so I'll need to do it again. Now, we could spend a whole episode down the line on the general election after it is complete, looking at the results and the news coverage of it, and I will be doing that. I might make it more of a video to analyse the results in a more politics show format. So that one's going to be more of a YouTube exclusive. So Spotify listeners, you will have to switch onto the other platform I use for that. But then again, this video will not be coming out until probably mid to late July, so it means I can actually analyse everything that comes out of Britain from the election. But anyway, enough of my dread to see what the electorate does in the UK. Let's just focus on today's show. Today, we're looking at the second part of our dissection of right wing by going into the right wing press of the present day. We have covered the press in general of the present day, but I think focusing in on the right wing specifically gives us certain questions. What is so unique about it? What does it look like compared to the general press? What does the right wing specifically cover in their news reporting? And what impact does this specific group have on the press landscape and politics in general? So let's get started, I guess. Actually, saying that, before we start, a bit of admin. I'd really recommend that you please listen to episode 3, the last episode, for the painfully extended attempt to give right wing a definition. It will give a lot of context for everything we're going to be discussing today. So yeah, just pause this episode and, I'll still be here waiting for you to come back. So yeah, just go to episode 3 now. Okay, you've listened to episode 3? Great. So, right wing, but the press. So the main question we need to address first is, what news media counts as right wing? It's a bit hard to say at times because, as we explored last episode, the definition of right-wing in the first place is quite vague and difficult to really pin down, so it's the exact same for the press. So I decided to delegate this task to my cavalcade to identify all the news sources that they would say fits their definition of right-wing. And we got a lot of common answers. The Daily Mail, The Sun, GB News, Fox News, Talk TV, the Daily Telegraph, and the Times were the most common answers I was given. More than half of the respondents answered most of these. But we also got a few other responses which had less people saying them, whether those answers be Breitbart, OAN, One American News. There's a really good video on them by John Oliver in his show Last Week Tonight. Give that episode a watch, it'll explain them quite heavily. But also, The Economist was actually put forward as one by one of our interviewees. One answer though, that came through from two people was one which I, in some way, was and was not expecting.
BBC is a deceptive one. I think it is very politically right-wing, but socially more left.
BBC is a right-wing media.
Yeah, the BBC. The news source which most people would define as probably the neutral source in at least British media. But these two respondents both gave this answer. They're both suspicious of the BBC's neutrality policy, and in their mind, the reality does not match the professed neutrality the BBC claims. Matty's answer had a very interesting explanation as to why he said it. So I'll play his extended answer right here.
To define a right-wing media, it has to be a media that sustains these ideas I've been talking about. And part of that has to be passive, and part of it has to be active. And that means you have two types of right-wing media. The passive is the BBC. The BBC is designed to sustain the dominant ideology. The dominant ideology of Britain, of what British is, because Britain's a difficult concept, and you can frame it as liberal principles in the Church of England and all those other things, but Britain in that context, that's what they're there to sustain. Which is why the BBC will sustain things like balance. It's become a running joke that the BBC's balance is that you can talk about something as 99% to 1% viewpoint-wise as climate change amongst scientists and go, well, we've got one that's talking about the dangers of climate change that will possibly kill millions of people if we're not careful, and somebody who's like, it's fine. They will get equal time and equal platform. But why? That doesn't make sense. And I say, it's balance. But balance doesn't mean 50-50. Balance means fair representation. And so the BBC is there to sustain dominant forms. Ask anybody in the north of England who was alive in the 1980s, and they'll tell you about the BBC, because the images that the BBC would show of certain events that took place, especially during the miners' strike, weren't necessarily representative of the events that actually occurred.
So he wants us to separate right-wing sources into the passive versus active right-wing categories. And this is a really interesting point that he raises, but I'm going to rebut this just slightly. I do think his point is interesting, as it brings into question the concept of objectivity and neutrality, and whether those actually exist when you have the power of news reporting. And on that front, I will agree with him. Objectivity is pretty much impossible in most contexts. However, his point should be contrasted by arguments within the more conservative circles that think the BBC is actually a left-wing news source. YouGov, in fact, has done polls since 2020 on this exact question. And the results were as follows. In their first poll in February 2020, 25% said that the BBC was neutral, 19% said it was right-wing, and 25% said it was left-wing biased. The rest said that they didn't know. Then the most recent poll in April 2024, the numbers were very similar with slight changes, with 27% neutral, 20% right-wing bias, 20% left-wing bias. The rest again answered that they didn't know. So the numbers are generally even on the thought of the BBC being either left or right-wing biased, with more people saying that it's actually neutral. But does that really make it a neutral source? We'll just leave that question hanging there, because I think that would take a whole episode to cover. But with all of those answers and our definitions of a right-wing press and what that even means, I wanted to see if the words we associate or associated with right-wing in our previous episode, once again please listen to episode 3, I wanted to see if they were actually being reflected in then right-wing press sources. So I took official news sources and their online publications to see what common threads existed in their reporting. Now, in order to ensure we get good coverage and a better understanding of the language being used by news sources, I took 3 right-wing news sources, those being the Daily Mail, otherwise known as the Mail Online, the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Express. I took one neutral or centrist position, the BBC, and one left-wing paper, The Guardian. The neutral and left-wing source I've taken as controls, but also as a contrast. So what I did was I scoured through the reports published on their websites for one day, this day being the 29th of May 2024. Now I'm focusing on the headlines more because I think those are more important than the actual content of the report. Those headlines are the things that draw you in to read the article in the first place. Now, this is going to be very opinion based, as you may get different conclusions to me. And in a final note, the right-wing sources I was looking at were more of this mishmash of UK and international news combined with op-eds, while the BBC and The Guardian had dedicated pages for UK news, which left out discussion of events outside the UK. So let's start with what was at the very top of the Mail Online's page when I got on at 9 AM on the 29th of May. They had a headline at the very top saying, quote, "Tories cut gap with Labour to 12 points. Rishi Sunak makes shock recovery as Keir Starmer faces new party meltdown over Diane Abbott farce." So firstly, that headline is way too long, but importantly, the wording needs to be contrasted by the rest of the sources that are used, because it deflects the most. It doesn't explain why Sunak is 12 points behind in the polls in the first place, which by the way is a massive gap, but instead the Mail Online pivots to issues in the Labour Party. The Daily Express didn't even report those poll numbers at all, but the Daily Telegraph did, with a shorter headline saying Tories just 12 points behind Labour in new election poll. The BBC didn't address the polling data either, and The Guardian just simply put Labour leading ahead of the election. So the way I analyse it here is the right-wing press sources were trying to make the best out of what looks to be a hopeless situation for Sunak and the Conservatives, with an election they are pretty much guaranteed to lose. It's just damage control at this point. So speaking of the Conservatives, the right-wing press was also covering some of their policy positions. The big one that was being focused on was the policy of cutting university degrees that, to Sunak and the Conservative Party, do not provide their vision of career progression. Now, how did the right-wing press word it? Well, let's have a see. The Mail Online used two phrases to describe these degrees: rip-off and Mickey Mouse. The Daily Express also used the term Mickey Mouse as part of their headline, but they also put in the headline that the policy would bring in 100,000 new apprenticeships as a replacement for those degrees that would be cut. The Telegraph's headline though was very much short and sweet: Mickey Mouse degrees to be axed. Now, this has been part of the Conservative Party's discussion for quite a while now. The dislike for specific degrees which they say either have high dropout rates or low opportunities for career progression post-university. The wording in reports for the BBC and The Guardian were similar, but they don't use the phrase Mickey Mouse. They were simply saying that the Conservatives are going to be cutting rip-off degrees. But let's pick apart that phrasing of Mickey Mouse, which the right-wing press were using. Now, that would be actually quoting certain Conservative Party officials, but the term Mickey Mouse actually implies this sort of idea that the degree, or whatever it is you describe, is completely worthless, whilst a rip-off would imply that whatever it is you're discussing might hold some value, but the costs of them are too high compared to what the payoff is. So those two phrases actually have a deeper meaning depending on which one you use, or even the inclusion of Mickey Mouse in the first place. Now obviously, to critique the policy, because I want to, the Tories don't specify what degrees those are. They haven't said about those apprenticeships if they'll actually increase the minimum wage for people on apprenticeships to make them financially viable for young people with the current cost of living crisis. Now, for context, the national minimum wage pay for an apprentice is £6.40 an hour, while the national living wage is £11.44. So yeah, really good policy there. Frankly, it's just an empty policy promise to most non-right-wing pundits. What it's also been regarded as in more popular circles is that it's an anti-youth policy. Speaking of anti-youth policies though, The Telegraph chose to give some focus to the recent announcement of national service made by Rishi Sunak. This is where Sunak is promising for 18-year-olds to have to do national service of military or civilian service, being given a small stipend, and all of this is supposedly to increase social cohesion and get skills on young people's CVs. The Telegraph were the only right-wing source to actually speak on this policy, probably because this policy sunk like a lead balloon with most voters, but particularly youth voters. But the Telegraph though, they've brought in opinion pieces for this specific topic. They brought in Hamish de Breton-Gordon and Lucy Denver. Breton-Gordon's op-ed is "Young people should welcome national service," whilst Denver's piece is entitled "National service is no act of youth hate, our depleted army desperately needs it." There's not really much to state with this one. I mean, no news service covered it outside of the Telegraph, and it's probably because most pundits have just seen it as a nothing policy. The Labour Party though was also a major focus across all of the sources. How their policy proposals were being framed changes quite drastically. Most right-wing sources focused on Starmer's policy announcements. They really honed in on the announcement of VAT on private school tuition fees, which the right-wing news sources were using as proof that Starmer is a sort of loony socialist, especially with the Telegraph. They had a headline about how the Reform Party will be preparing a legal challenge for, quote, discriminatory, that's in speech marks by the way, private school tax rate, end quote. But also an opinion piece by Philip Johnston entitled "Sir Keir Starmer is a red-blooded socialist wolf in sheep's clothing." Okay. The Guardian, meanwhile, put headlines about Starmer's promise to cut the NHS waiting list in England within 5 years. So you can see within these discussions, The Guardian's was a bit more positive, talking about this is the policy that we're doing here. Whilst with the right-wing press, it's more lambasting those policies that Starmer is putting forward. And then I just want to point out all the smaller pieces, which were also among the headlines. The Daily Express had a whole section on royal family news, looking at Princess Kate being in public whilst undergoing cancer treatment, surmising why Prince Harry declined an invite from King Charles to stay at the royal residence, or focusing on the, quote, latest embarrassment for Meghan Markle with the loss of some property for her and her husband, Prince Harry. In this area, there's a very heavy emphasis on Harry and Meghan in a negative light. One story which had a bit of traction was the investigation into Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner's history of council home ownership. The Mail Online's headline, this is their wording by the way, was on the anger of Angela Rayner's neighbours, with the police starting a probe into her owning 2 houses. The Telegraph followed it up by saying that HMRC were being urged to state if they will sanction Rayner. But then you saw a completely different tone in the BBC and The Guardian, where the BBC just stated that there will be no police action, or the wording in The Guardian where Rayner has been fully cleared of criminal wrongdoing. So one side, the right-wing presses, are trying to make a scandal out of this, while the more neutral source and the more left-wing source are reporting that there was no wrongdoing whatsoever. Also noteworthy are the high number of headlines on celebrity news that were in right-wing news website homepages. There was a focus on Eamon Holmes, the next phase in the Wagatha Christie saga, but then on the BBC and The Guardian, celebrity news was a bit like tumbleweed, either nothing or very little. But one aspect from this survey that I really want to focus on is not just what a news site does report and say, but what it doesn't report. Now, not everything can be reported, but there's also a consistent choice of what and how you report things. And sometimes things are just not chosen. I'll give an example, which is not focused on the right-wing press specifically, but the press in general. What has happened in the last week in Rafah was absolutely horrific. Countless numbers of people, many children included, dead. It was reported on Sky, BBC, ITV, and most other sites, but not the right-wing presses. And even when I did see those reports, something just felt off. So why did I feel off about this? I felt this dissonance in seeing the images coming from Rafah with the reporting of Gaza that we've seen in the last 8-ish months. My social media feed has been filled to the brim for months on end of so many people suffering under a barrage of missiles, temporary shelters, basic necessities and resources being cut off, uncertainty, displacement, death, destruction, and no chance of escape. What many human rights associations have for so long been calling an open-air prison. There has been no sign of a ceasefire, nor does it appear that it will be happening anytime soon, even with yet another instance of Gazan civilians killed by missile strikes. It won't end. Yet we didn't really see this being covered on the news for a long time, with a couple of news companies as exceptions. The main way you would see this was people showing you what was posted on social media, talking to those you know, and the message being spread around. That was the dissonance I felt. That silence. That's what made me feel off. The fact that I and so many others have seen this suffering for months and calling for better reporting, a more honest conversation, and most importantly, a ceasefire. This was even discussed by so many people that I interviewed. More than half brought up Gaza at some point in their answers, and many saw the reporting of Gaza as either being silent, disingenuous, or both at the same time. Now, this topic is too large for me to be able to do it any justice in either one section of an episode or a whole episode for that matter. But to relate it to what I saw in these headlines from this survey, only one of the 3 right-wing presses even mentioned Rafah. And even then, it wasn't the focus. The focus was on pro-Palestine protesters occupying a historical building and asking why Ireland was a fanatical supporter of Palestine. That's their wording, by the way. Even on Rafah, it only discussed the fire in the camp after the bombing itself. Not the missiles and not the dozens killed. This is what I mean. Silence. A dissonance between what you see and what is reported. Is this limited to the right-wing press? Not at all. But this survey displayed that issue very clearly through this specific example. What is said, how it is said, but also what isn't said, and how we then rewire our brains from that content or lack thereof. So, we've gone through a lot there, but we get an idea of what the right-wing press looks like, what it wants to cover in their work, what matters to them, and then how important wording is in how a story is presented. We saw presentation of ideas of anti-socialism, celebrities and their private lives, discussion of public policy, and each press source's vision for what might be best. We saw what mattered to them and what didn't. Or maybe it's better to say, we saw what mattered to their readers and what didn't. So this then pushes us forward to talk about the question of impact. They can cover all the news that they want, But if there's no actual impact from these news sources, then there is no point in analysing it. So that's what I asked my interviewees. And what we saw is that the right-wing press's impact to the people I spoke to was slightly different to the answers we got in episode 2 about the press's impact in general. The first and main impact was how the right-wing press acted to them as an organ for the ideas of right-wing political groups and parties.
I suppose it might be, in a way, trying to shape or influence the ideas that are discussed. You know, it might be that the Conservative Party or a political party of the right has a certain policy platform that it wants to, promote and spread to voters. But then sometimes it can be, through op-ed pieces in publications that suggest certain ideas. So often it might be opinion pieces that are rejecting the expansion of the ULEZ scheme in London, for example.
Well, I mean, you can look in the news today, and I think the Telegraph had let Suella Braverman write an op-ed in there about whether they're questioning the police's impartiality and pushing for a ban on the pro-Palestinian march this weekend. And that's been headline news for like 3 days now, I think. So definitely has an influence.
So I think I'd refer back to my earlier statement in terms of the framing of stories. So the right-wing media will frame a story within the values they hold. Just I need to say this as well, just as the left will. I'm not attacking the right wing in any way.
But then this has the impact of what we've spoken of previously with the echo chambers.
Now, I want to make this part of the point quite clear, is that a lot of the political influence that I see right-wing media having is actually observed online. So it's more of the fact that when we walk around in the street in person, we don't usually discuss our politics with strangers, but when we're online or on a forum or a YouTube comment section, then that's when it all comes out. That's when people tell you what they think, with using the anonymity of the internet. But then the issue with that is that you don't really know people's locations necessarily. You don't really know what's their backstory or their backdrop, and maybe perhaps there is some sort of it might be skewed data in the sense that the type of people that would be posting political things online would be more polarized people.
Okay, so we've gone from newspapers to social media platforms. So there's so much more news that you can get. There's so much more you can see, and there's so much more available to you. Yes, but then we have your feed being adjusted for you. So if you start interacting with one type, that's by and large the only type you're going to get, really, unless you go searching for another type. So, I mean, this isn't just a right-wing thing either. I think this could be put on the other side as well.
But the final impact spoken of was what the impact was from more extreme right-wing sources with normalising extremist opinions.
There's a certain element of like creating this like little stronghold community where it's like, oh, that person's finally saying what I think should be said, which will happen on both sides of the political spectrum. But I think generally the right wing comes across a bit more aggressive and basically being quite anti-progressive. And I think if anything, these really far right seems to try reflect what they think this audience is going to want to hear, as opposed to producing some sort of insightful investigative journalism.
My immediate thought is what's been occurring in America with like the book bans and the bans on being trans in various states, and once again the sensationalism of, oh, trans people are dangerous, trans people are radicalizing your children, queer media is radicalizing your children. All of that is something that immediately comes to mind.
So from that, we got an idea of what a specific grouping of press sources can do within the wider purview of political and social life. But I also wanted to see what this impact looks like on a more individual scale. In other words, how does it affect you in your daily life? Do you even interact with it at all? Why or why not? So let's hear from those who feel it had some form of impact, whatever that was. because some people said that they consume it for balance.
The area I grew up in, so obviously I'm a Londoner, and as we know, London has always been very typically left-wing. It's always been Labour. So I think where I grew up is definitely one aspect of why I was, quite left-wing when I was younger. And I sort of got exposed to more right-wing ideas, and I exposed myself to them so that I can engage with some of them in a way to expand and open up my, political affiliation, or expand my political ideas and understandings. And that's probably why I shifted more to the center. So I definitely engage with right-wing ideas.
I suppose as someone who is sort of generally interested in politics, but is also interested in the general media landscape at the moment, I do have a look to see what the talking points are in some of these papers. I would happily sit down and read an edition of the Times, because I think that there can be quite good journalism in there, often very good journalism. And in fact, I do listen to Times Radio, so I think I'm happy to sort of interact with some of these newspapers, things we might call right-wing.
But in addition, we also saw from many the impact being a culture of avoidance.
I avoid it. Is the simple answer. I consume my news through iNewspaper. I try to avoid most news. Social media, which I tend to try and take with a grain of salt. I check The Guardian, I check the BBC. I avoid interacting with it, and I'm quite fortunate that I don't have any relatives that have taken it upon themselves to be delighted with the Sun and follow it blindly. But I think, like I said, the reason I avoid it is because I try to avoid tabloids and the gossip mags.
The most interesting answer I got on this one, though, was from two people who said that they agree with one or maybe two right-wing opinions, although they don't identify with the right wing per se. And for them, it raised this issue of a sort of polar opposites for the right wing as an ideology, but also the press. In other words, what things were fine and where they draw the line.
I mean, I said I read The Economist. If we do agree that that's sort of center-right, sure, that's definitely one thing. I don't think The Economist wakes any strong feelings or emotions in me. It's usually just for informative stuff, especially I work in the energy sector. I like the fact that their journalism has actual numbers and figures. It's important for me to see. So that's one thing for sure that impacts me in a nice ways. But I have to say, the majority of me interacting with the right-wing media is through memes. And I have to say, how it affects me is it probably alienates me even more. And I'm very aware of that. And I think one thing that I'm trying to work really hard on is to sort of be able to have these conversations with different people. And I would say there's definitely potential to do it. And I've only spoken about that one example where it was just completely unable to hear each other. But I find that most of the time you are able to have a conversation with the person. It's just a lot about respect and actually hearing what everyone has to say.
But on some level, there are sometimes, I think there is also this, if you do support some right-wing views, you are afraid to kind of say anything about it, for example, because I would identify as centre-left, but I don't think every single thing that the Tories have ever come up with is bad, and I think there is this kind of culture of, because in Suella Braverman's speech about the lifestyle choice, yes, I disagree with a lot of it, but there were one or two sentences where I was like, okay, this isn't very humane, but I see her point. But if I was standing with a group of my friends, I would never want to say that, because I would be so afraid of someone being like, oh, you're a Tory, how dare you say that? That's such a horrible thing to say. Do you know what I mean?
I think that these answers raise interesting questions if and when we treat the right wing and the right wing press as a blob and not smaller factions and ideas. It leads to that culture of avoidance. Now, I think it's pretty obvious from the past few episodes that I am not right wing, but I don't avoid the right wing press. Although I do understand why some people I interviewed want to do so and do avoid it. But for me, there's this danger in completely blocking out the right-wing sources. We need to be fully aware of what the right wing is and its different faces. From the right-leaning centrist, to the backbench Tory MP, to the anti-immigrant that voted Brexit or was in support of the Rwanda policy, or both, or other extreme right-wingers. We always need to remember that the idea of right-wing is a spectrum of opinion, and the sources that those people on that spectrum seek out, those sources are going to be different. They'll say different things, and some of those will be more palatable than others to people who don't identify as right-wing. So that is something we need to be aware of going forward, and why I needed 2 episodes to break down the present right-wing, both ideologically and in the press. It's really complex. So the 2 things I would hazard are, firstly, not to generalise it. Be more specific about which right-wingers and right-wing press sources we're speaking about, since the term is too vague and encompasses too many policy positions and ideas. And secondly, each press source is trying to achieve different ends, although there are overlaps and agreements on quite a few policies. They'll each have their own editorial policy, and therefore, as we have seen, they're going to have different focuses in what to report and how to report it. To get us to a sort of conclusion then, the right-wing press, in my mind, and from what we've learned from this episode then, is a branch of the press that pushes for varying and overlapping ideological ends in their reporting. Whether that be the pursuit of continued deregulation like a Thatcherite, anti-immigrant xenophobia with a Rwanda policy, maintaining the status quo in society, or any other of a litany of policy positions. What they focus on, and how they phrase it, can also have an influence on how we think about things. Even if you aren't consuming it, you still have an idea in your mind of what the right-wing press is and says. And that probably reinforces your avoidance of it. Or it may help you to read it, as we've heard from a couple of people. Their impact can be seen in multiple ways, but especially political policy and popular sentiment, all from reading that sheet of paper or online article. It has an impact, and that hasn't changed at all. Not now, and not in history either. The only difference would be the topics focused on, dependent on the historical and social situation. So maybe that means we should now dig into my actual research and look at the right wing and its press historically. But let's leave that for another day. Thank you so much everyone for listening to this episode of Same Old News. As always, I really appreciate every listen, it really does mean a lot to me, and it would mean even more to me if on YouTube you like the video, or on Spotify you give this show a rating. Also, please do follow our social medias, the links to which are in the description for the episode. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram to get further updates about this show. Next episode though, we're going to be moving back in time. That sounded really corny, didn't it? But yeah, we're moving back in time to look at what I'm actually researching in my PhD, and starting to understand the historical situation of what the right-wing press in the period 1780 to 1830 was dealing with. But nonetheless, thank you so much for listening once again, and I'll see you soon for the Same Old News. Thanks for listening.